I'm excited today to have a couple of great guests with us for the next part of our conversation. I am joined by Frank Brown, who is our CEO of the Communities and Schools of Atlanta, and T.N Korman, who is a Senior Associate Partner at Bellwether Education Partners. I just wanted to mention up front, if we have enough time, we're hoping we'll have some time for some questions and answers. You'll see to the right of your screen, there's an audience participation button. If you're in full screen, you'll have to get out of it to find it, but it's on your right-hand side. If you got some questions, please put those in as we're having our conversation, and hopefully we'll have some time to ask our guests to answer some of your questions today. But I'd love to start with Haley. Haley, Ray mentioned earlier today that you had put together, you published an alarming report that estimated that, and when we think about in the past year during the pandemic, that there were approximately 3 million marginalized students around the country who were missing from school. So we'd love to start there and have you tell us more about what you found in that report.
Yeah, I am happy to talk a bit about that analysis. The first thing I want to make sure that everyone understands, it's only an estimate. And the reason it's only an estimate is because we don't have good data. We don't have national data. We rarely have good local data. So back in October, we decided to pull together this estimate to help people understand the scale. What is the possibility? Because when we think by classroom or even by school, right, 1 or 2 kids missing from a classroom, a dozen kids missing from a school, it can feel like a small number. It can feel like the sort of thing, our school social worker can take care of that. We've got people knocking on doors. We know teachers are calling. What happens when you add up all those 12s and 10s and 18s across the country? So what we did was we created a deduplicated super subgroup. And what that means was we looked at all of the national data that were available, and we found those data sets on the groups of students who have historically been faced with obstacles in getting to school and doing well in school, for whom there is good national data. So we necessarily had to leave out some groups of students, for example, students who are pregnant and parenting, because we don't have good national data on that population. And then we tried to do some deduplication because we know that many students who, for example, are English learners are also eligible to participate in the migrant education program. But it's not the same group of students. We know there is a lot of overlap, but they're not identical. So we did the best we could to deduplicate. So we had this population of students who we describe as sort of historically, educationally marginalized. And our analysis asked the question of what would happen if just 1% of them, your students who are experiencing homelessness, students in foster care, English learners, students with disabilities, what if 1% of them weren't coming to school? 5%, 10%, 25%. And we actually think 25% holds up with what we're seeing from data coming out of schools and districts. Well, if 25% of those kids aren't showing up in classrooms, that's more than 3 million kids. That is larger than the school-age population of the state of Florida, right? It's no longer a handful of kids here, a handful of kids there. This is a crisis. You really wanted folks to understand the scale of the problem, but what we're not able to do is answer the next key questions, which are who is missing and why.
Great. So quick follow-up, Haley. I know that Chairman Scott kind of said earlier to us, I think something that we all know is the starting point. Students who were kind of missing from school, they didn't have computers and they didn't have access to Wi-Fi.
Mm-hmm.
But I know your study was looking to say even beyond that, there were other things that were going on as to why students weren't there. Tell us a little bit about beyond the computers and the Wi-Fi, what else was going on?
Right. So we think it's incredibly important for state leaders, district leaders, and school leaders to be out asking in their communities, asking their families, asking their young people this question of who is missing and why. For many students, we know there is a digital divide problem to solve. It is both device access and broadband access. It is the relationship between the two of those. It is competition for broadband time, even where you have multiple devices. If you don't have high-speed internet, it's not an easy problem to solve. We also know some students are having a hard time accessing school because they're not receiving the language supports that they need for our English learners. We know that students with disabilities aren't always receiving the support that they are entitled to that will allow them to access remote learning. We know that some of our younger students, their families have made decisions to potentially not enroll them in kindergarten this year, just hold them back for another year. And then we know at the far other end of the age spectrum, many of our 17, 18, 19-year-olds, sort of year 13 high school students may have stopped out just short of graduation. Some of them have transitioned to the workforce. They may be primary wage earners for their families. I'm sure many of the folks in our audience have either read stories or had experiences of high school students dialing into a Zoom call from their job. And they're trying to juggle both things simultaneously. But we know that there are populations of students for whom their families and their communities are disproportionately experiencing the direct effects of the pandemic, the economic hardship, potentially losses in their families. They may have, a parent may have died, right? So they may be stepping into that wage earner role. They may be stepping into a caregiving role. They may be providing education support for a younger sibling. There's a constellation of reasons, and we need to understand what they are.
Great. Thanks, Haley. So that helps us. Frank, I want to turn to you. So as Haley's kind of helping us understand, and you on the ground, you and your team are facing this complicated set of factors. So would love to kind of turn to you now, Frank, and kind of hear about how you and your team in Atlanta took it on. What have you guys been doing? How have you guys gone about trying to re-engage students, and how you guys are doing the work?
Well, thank you so much. I want to thank Ray and the national office for inviting us. This is our first time participating in an event like this. And as you know, Juan, CIS of Atlanta started this whole network 50 years ago next year. So we are the originators of this movement. So me and my staff are working every day to innovate what we do. And I think you heard Congressman Scott say it, high school is not enough. So in Atlanta, we have already been engaged in supporting our kids past high school. We have about 2,500 kids in 4 school districts and 57 schools across those 4 school districts. And we also support 107 of our alumni who are in colleges and universities across this country. And we believe that every kid we serve has to be a full participant in the American dream. And when we say that, we mean a homeowner, a taxpayer, a positive addition to their community, and a community leader. So that's why, with the help of BET, what we did was give away over $600,000 in emergency assistance to over 2,500 of our families. And the majority, I hear this conversation going on about disconnection. It's bigger than that in Atlanta. Atlanta is the income inequality capital of the country. For the last 2 years, the poorest of the poor people of color are in the city that we serve. So we know that you have to get something past high school. 2/3 of the jobs in this economy, as Congressman Scott said, require post-high school certifications. So we cannot beat our chest as a network and be proud that we're getting poor Black and brown kids out of usually low-performing high schools, and we don't track what happens to them afterwards. So to see that Ray has embraced what we're doing here in Atlanta, and that's now having a caseload that goes from 3rd grade to seniors in college. And we don't celebrate just high school graduations on Mother's Day. We have college graduations and technical school graduations, because that's the caseload that's closer to the American dream than any that we serve. And that turns into real economic mobility. Everybody knows a person with a college degree earns over their lifetime over $1 million more than a high school diploma, a person who has a high school diploma. So why would we tell poor Black and brown kids, which is the majority of the network we serve, that high school is enough? So the innovation in Atlanta and that is being embraced across the country is not enough, and that we now must provide supports past high school. That's why we gave over $60,000 in tuition assistance. We're talking about the debt. We're paying college tuition so they don't have to take out loans. And I think the whole network has to embrace that trajectory of just 3rd grade until they graduate college or technical school.
Great. Thanks, Frank. And so that's incredible to hear about the expansion model, right? Particularly as we're hearing a lot of conversation at the federal level about the potential for 2 years of community college, and now thinking of pre-K through 14 as the new system. Wanted to ask you just a short one here to follow up. In addition to kind of the emergency assistance you gave to families, you talked about some of the tuition piece on the other end as well too. Give us some examples of some of the other things during the pandemic that you guys are doing in Atlanta with your students.
Well, Well, we were already engaged. We were dealing with the most vulnerable kids anyway. So nothing changed for us. We just got deeper. So with our
Right.
emergency assistance, it got deeper. With
Okay.
our home visits and health check-ins, it got deeper. We also had great corporate support. Rourke Capital came in, a private equity group that's based here in Atlanta and owns everything from Dunkin' Donuts to Arby's, and gave us $400,000 to work in 3 APS schools. We've had
Yeah.
Deloitte come in and pay us now to work in another APS school. So CIS of Atlanta was found by the Wallace Foundation back in 2016 as the oldest practitioner of collective impact in the country. That's bringing government, nonprofits, and corporations together. So we believe that we have a blueprint for the rest of the network to follow. And that's really having a good sense of corporate engagement, that's having your government, and we have braided funding. We just don't rely on federal funding. We have county
Sure.
funding. We have local funding. We have city funding in some instances that comes in. So I think you have to be diverse in your fundraising apparatus. But more importantly, I'm going to step back. One thing we did do that I want to highlight is that we gave the biggest bonus out to our site coordinators ever in the company's history, $250,000. And when we talk, the most important asset is not me, it's not Ray, it's Jeanette and the thousands of site coordinators who go into schools every day and work 12 months a year, 7 days a week. We gave out on average bonuses of $4,000 to $6,000 to our site coordinators using our PPP loan. That got them. We couldn't do anything without them. So to know, and we gave over $50,000 in emergency assistance to our site coordinators to help pay for their shortcomings. Because if they weren't engaged, I'm just talking. Nothing would have happened. So we took care of home first. And I thank my
Okay.
board for giving me the authority to do that. You got to take care of home. You can't go out there and help other people if the people you're sending to schools, their lights is off or they can't put food. How are they motivated to help the poor and the poor? Our site coordinators are only 2 steps away from the people we serve. So getting that salary up to $50,000, $60,000 is something the network must do because our work is predicated and the success is predicated on who we put in these schools across the country. And if they're underpaid, if they're under-resourced, if they don't have work plans and they're not being properly managed, the collective impact will be zero because you won't have effective outcomes that change kids'
Absolutely.
lives and make them full participants in the American dream.
Great, great. So let me follow up, Frank. So I know got to take care of the family, right? We got to take care of the CIS family as part of the strategy. But as you mentioned earlier, I think folks who are watching right now are going to be interested. How did you do it? Tell us a little bit about how you were doing the funding pieces, these corporate relationships. What was kind of local, state, federal, nonprofit, business? What was the combination, and what would be your best advice to folks on how to get it done?
Well, we've been doing it every day. I don't think it's something you got to wait on a crisis for. You should be diversifying your funding every day as a nonprofit. That's just best practice. We also did not, we have reserves, over $3 million in reserves that we manage this crisis. So I think you got to run a good business first. Before you do good work, you got to have a financially stable business that can pay people. So for us, what we're trying to give people a blueprint of is you got to have a strategic plan. We had a 5-year plan that we just adjusted on the edges that was already geared as far as deepening our impact. We had a goal of having over 95% of the kids on our caseload do one of two things: graduate high school on time or earn promotion to the next grade. So we are working now on a strategic plan that we will roll out next year for the next 5 years. So you got to have a strategic, you got to have the right board. You got to have the right leadership. I think CIS as a network needs more diversity in the leadership ranks. I think I have a different perspective running this organization because I'm one of those kids. I have a brother doing 15 years for voluntary manslaughter. I come from a low income community. I know, but for my education, I wouldn't be on this august panel with you today. So having diversity in leadership, having great boards that are really into the mission and that fundraise, not just cheerlead, but fundraise, and having a brand like CIS. I think the national office has done a great job with marketing. We are one of 5 markets to get extra support as far as making sure the logo and so it's a whole hodgepodge of things you have to do over time well. So it's no magic wand. If you You got to get a good
Sure.
development director. You have, you got to have plans, and you got to be able to execute. I think that's
Absolutely.
what we are doing here in Atlanta. We're not just talking. Janetta tell you, we're executing, and we're following these kids and tracking them so we'll know whether Johnny or Evelyn graduates from college or technical school and can report that back to our funders.
Great, fantastic. Thanks, Frank. Haley, let me go back to you. Once again, when we think about the challenge for a lot of the schools, which is around the funding, but we heard Chairman Scott talk about this a little bit earlier about the funds that are available through the American Rescue Plan. So we'd love to kind of get your thoughts from what you saw in your report, this complicated set of factors that are going on. What are some of the ways that you think the schools and the districts can take advantage of that funding to find and re-engage the students who've been lost during the pandemic?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are a couple of things that I think about, and I put them into three big categories. I think about guidance, I think about resources, and I think about expectations, right? We've got folks in every school building out there caring about kids, looking for kids, whether it is from someone from CIS, whether it is classroom teacher, it's a bus driver, it's the office manager. But folks are doing this often without good guidance. Some of them are very good at it. Some of them are networked in with organizations like CIS, and they're getting good guidance about how to do that well. For others, this is the first time they have tried to do something like this. So finding ways to deliver that high quality guidance, what works, right? What really helps to get connected with kids and understand what they need. Then I think about resources, right? How do you actually pay for that stuff? You need more people out on the ground, knocking on doors. People are doing this in their free time. They're doing it on weekends. How do we resource that? How do we make that sustainable? Sometimes that's just additional headcount. Sometimes that's bonusing. Sometimes it's around rallying and training volunteers. But it is not the kind of thing you can just sort of like collect people and send them out and assume they'll do well, right? They need to be trained. So we need resources to do that. We need expectations. We need people to understand what they ought to do when they find themselves encountering a family with a child who's not enrolled in school. And that goes far beyond the school building, right? The office manager knows what to do when the family comes in and someone's not been enrolled. But does the person working the intake desk at the health clinic know what to do, who to call, who to talk to? Right? So delivering those kinds of expectations and building them into our funding strategies is a way to make sure that we have coherent plans to support young people. The other thing that I think is really important for folks to keep in mind is as they're designing a strategy, and you do need to design a strategy, thinking about, informed by that, who is missing and why. So I've learned that it is a lot of my 5-year-olds never signed up for kindergarten, right? I need a strategy to connect with them versus a lot of my 18-year-olds never finished high school, right? It's a very different strategy to get them what they need. And then thinking about designing for our highest need young people as the place where we begin, not the afterthought. And I noticed we had an audience question about punitive approaches to attendance and the sort of invocation of truancy statutes and the ways in which those can escalate. We really want to think about folks orienting towards what are the needs and how do we meet them with a shared goal of supporting a healthy transition to adulthood over the longer term. And asking ourselves, right, if does threatening this parent with arrest, will that support a healthy transition to adulthood for this 17-year-old who's been working full-time and not attending school? And so helping us orient around that healthy transition to adulthood through school, thinking about our highest need students, the solution for the English learner with special education needs who is having difficulty connecting to the internet every day is going to solve problems for almost every one of your kids. So rather than focusing on the 80% and thinking we'll get to those other kids later at the end, start with them. Solve the problems for them, and you will find yourself having solved most of the problems in front of you.
Great. Thank you very much. And what I'd love to do now, just quick answers here, because I want to make sure you do get to a couple of these kind of questions. So we'd love to go back, Frank, to you. When we think about short answer here, Is there anything else we haven't talked about yet that you'd love to kind of share with folks that you think is a critical piece that they should be thinking about in this work moving forward?
I think housing, the housing crisis. Most of us are working in schools that have transient rates of 60% or above. And it's about housing. 71% of the over $600,000 we gave out was for housing. So we're talking about connectivity. If I don't have a house, the laptop and the Wi-Fi doesn't matter. So I think there has to be something. You see some movement with the tripling of the child tax credit. I think that's good. I think increasing Pell Grants is good. But I think there should be an expansion of Title IV money for school districts, not just for the temporary hit of when they can use this last piece of money for the next couple of years, but to make it a permanent, legislative priority to provide wraparound supports to kids of poverty. Over 51% of the kids in the public school systems today, the first time ever, qualify for free and reduced lunch, which means that the majority of the kids are poor kids in our public schools. So this is something that the federal government must do more. I think states, different things here like our lottery and things like that. All government entities must invest more in education, I think, across the board. But I also think that corporations are stepping up. And I think we're relying too much on government to our chagrin. And we're really turning our back on corporations like Rourke, who've never done this type of community engagement before and are coming with wisdom and resources and holding us to account as if we're one of their for-profit investments. So we are now being held to account in a different way and developing new sophistications on how to solve these problems, bigger in a way the government can imagine, but in a collective impact way that we started back in the 70s, and now we're adjusting it for the realities of today.
Okay, so we just got a couple more minutes left, so just a couple of quick questions here. So Frank, the audience wants to know, how many site coordinators do you have per school currently?
Well, some site coordinators where we have additional funding, we might have two, but on average, it's usually one site coordinator in every school.
Okay, and then kind of follow up here is folks want to know if you have any staff who are dedicated only to finding the missing students right now.
Well, all of our site coordinators, a lot of those kids were on our caseload. So our site coordinators, and we have managers who are helping, and we have senior team members who are helping. So it's a triage of the whole programs department, because it's not just finding them, but what do you do when you find them? What if you find out that Johnny is rich? Finding them is one thing, but we bring money to the table to get Johnny and his family in a home. We put families up for a month here in Atlanta if they become homeless. And housing is a critical piece. And also facts medically that have been happening. 78% of the kids, Black and brown, were infected by COVID, and they were 85 times more likely to have to go to the hospital. They lost grandmothers, people of color, lost thousands of family members, grandmothers, aunts, caretakers. So now you got a generation without any caretakers. This has been a devastating trifle of just crisis in a city that was already the income inequality capital of the country before COVID.
Great, fantastic. Haley, let me turn back to you. We just got about a minute left. Any final thoughts you'd like to kind of share with folks that we haven't had a chance to cover up to this point? Just final words for our audience.
I think one key thing I would love for folks in this audience to know is just earlier this week, the Treasury Department approved spending on infrastructure, specifically things like data sharing tools and interoperability, which I know is not a fun or exciting thing to focus on. And it also doesn't always feel urgent when you know there's real kids not coming to school. But the way we find them and the way we know how to support them is having good data. And that's how we know whether what we're doing is working. And for the most part right now, states and districts just don't have the technical capacity to take that on. That is something they can spend some of this money on. And I would really encourage people to consider investing in that.
Fantastic, fantastic. Well, thank you, Frank. Thank you, Haley, for this conversation today. Also wanted to say thanks to everybody who kind of joined us today for this conversation. You saw from the beginning when we started with our president, with Ray kind of telling us and reminding us about this tough year that we've gone through, a year of loss, delayed dreams, But he also kind of put out the challenge of us to reimagine our schools. We heard Chairman Scott talk about the notion, and I love that he said, we made sure that the money is there to solve this. This is solvable. It can get done. And then you heard from our earlier panel with folks kind of talking about what's actually going on in Frank's team and Jeanette and Evelyn and what they're doing in Atlanta to kind of what they've been doing to kind of for years and also during the pandemic to kind of get it done. And once again, we see that in the result of Evelyn getting back in there and graduating, getting ready to go to college. Fantastic. Congratulations again. So we just want to say thanks again to everybody who kind of helped us with this kind of conversation today and in our event today. Thank you all for kind of joining us. Wanted to remind you that the sessions from today's summit are going to be available on demand on this site for the next 30 days. We look forward to you joining us again on August the 12th for the second part of the Milliken Dialogues and Policy Summit. Once again, on behalf of Communities and Schools, thank you all very much for joining us, and we will see you all soon. Thanks.